Helen Douthwaite Teasdale, and welcome to Brass Evolution, a show where we explore the rich culture and history of the brass banding world. This episode, I'm chatting to Simone Rebello about the history of percussion in brass bands. We talk about the journey from solitary timekeeper to incredible virtuoso soloists and vast sections performing on a wonderful variety of instruments, and the compositions that propelled percussion forward. This includes a change to our usual podcast opening music, the iconic opening to Gilbert Vinter's Salute to Youth, performed by the CWS Manchester Band. So welcome to the podcast, Simone. There's not many people in the brass band world who don't know who you are, but for those who don't, could you give us a little introduction to yourself?
Thank you very much, Helen. My name's Simone Rebello. I am a percussionist and I'm from Thornton Heath originally in South London. I came up to Manchester in the late 80s to become a student at the Royal Northern College of Music. And while I was at the RNCM, I joined Foden's brass band. And that's where my connection, if you like, with brass bands comes from.
So was that your first band, Foden's brass band?
Pretty much, yeah, pretty much. So I did a couple of, I think I did one contest with a local band. I think it was the Trafford band, if I remember rightly. But because Howard Snell was the director of brass at the RNCM at the time, I came into contact with him quite early on, and he invited me to join the band. So that was really the first band that I joined, if you like.
Well, I've got to say, Baptism of Fire, one of the best bands in the UK and all the world. So there you go. Fantastic start. So obviously today we're talking about the history of brass band percussion. When we think of brass bands, I don't want to say it, but sometimes we neglect the percussion section, and they are so intertwined, so connected. So how did you get into sort of researching and learning about the history of brass band percussion section?
Well, I was asked to write articles for the Brass Herald magazine by Philip Biggs, and I think I wrote an article for every edition of the Brass Herald. So and Philip was very kind. He said to me, "Look, just write whatever you want." So I would write one article. I would write something about some practical tips of playing the marimba or whatever it was, and then one day I sort of thought, you know what, I don't know anything about percussion in brass bands, despite the fact that I've played in Foden's for nearly 10 years. I don't really know anything about the background or the history, and I thought it might make a good article. So I started researching it, and it turned into about 3 or 4 articles. Actually, they just kind of went one after the other, and I was very interested in it because I'm a little bit of a history buff anyway. So and actually from a musical point of view, I work at the Royal Northern College of Music now myself. I'm the Director of Percussion, and with the students, I like them to know about the history of what they're doing, because I think it really informs what you do now, if you see what I mean. So we play a lot of music now, for example, in the percussion repertoire, solo repertoire, that's very, very modern, written in the last 10, 20 years. But I think it's important for the students to know, for example, where our repertoire started as solo percussionists, solo marimba players. So I kind of kicked myself a little bit for not doing it earlier to find out about the history of percussion in brass bands. And then actually during the lockdown, I was asked by Brass Bands England to do a presentation, one of their Zoom presentation things, again on a topic of my choice. And I thought, oh, do you know what? I'd really like to explore this even further. So I enjoyed really digging around and finding out more about it. But I'm really glad I did. It puts a lot of things into perspective, actually. And it also made me realize that, at the time when I came into brass bands, it was in the sort of the late 80s or so, that percussion in brass bands, although it had existed for a long time, it really exploded at that kind of time. And I didn't know that at the time, because obviously, how would I? It was only after I'd left Foden's, and then actually quite a few years later, and I looked back over that period of time and thought, gosh, I was so lucky. I mean, I was kind of in the right place at the right time, basically. But I never realised what was happening at the time. But looking into the history of the whole area has made me really realise where I was at that time in terms of a very important time in the brass band movement for percussion.
So I started playing in bands sort of middle of the 90s, beginning of the noughties. And at that point, the brass band percussion section we were flourishing, like soloists like yourself. We had 4 or 5 percussionists playing every instrument under the sun. So thinking about a time before that is quite difficult for me. And some of the pieces, obviously, we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but some of the pieces involving, one percussionist on one instrument, it just blows my mind. From your research, Simone, where did it all begin for percussionists in brass band? Do we have an origin story here?
Well, kind of. I mean, brass bands, by and large, came out of church bands, if you like, so which was a collection of brass and wind, and then eventually just became brass. So used in a church situation. So obviously percussion really not in that, but fairly early on, bands were doing marching. So, of course, that would bring a bass drum and a snare drum at least into play. So that's where the story starts really for percussion. Then when you start looking into bands then beginning to be used more for entertainment, if you like, so playing on bandstands, playing promenade concerts, playing at the end of the pier, those kind of outdoor events, then the percussion would have obviously a little more to do. So that usually a single percussionist would then be playing a mixture of bass drum, snare drum, maybe some cymbals, maybe some temple blocks or some wood blocks or something to add a little bit of colour. And because the repertoire that the bands were playing was more arrangements, so arrangements of orchestral music, arrangements of opera, excerpts, if you like, and also playing music of the day, music of the time. So if you're in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, those kind of popular songs, if you like, that would be transcribed or arranged for the band. So the percussion would be sort of adding colour. And actually, early on, it was often because when you look at those very early sets of parts for bands, often the percussion part would just say ad lib. So if you were playing a Mozart overture, let's say the Magic Flute, the percussionists would just kind of add things in as they felt appropriate. The first time, well, one of the earliest, might not be the very first one, but one of the earliest parts was written by Alexander Owen, who was at Bessie's of the Barn, actually, did a lot of arranging for the band, and he wrote a timpani part. I think it's still in their library. It's 1884. It was the piece called Heroic, which was based on a set of themes by Weber. And that's kind of generally believed to be, if not the first, one of the first. It's an actual timpani part for the player to play, whereas up to that point it had been a little bit more kind of just add some kind of cymbal crashes and things in where you feel it's appropriate. So that's how it kind of started, and then kind of grew from there, because as the band concerts got more involved, then the percussionist, when you're outside, the percussionist was a little restricted, because if you're in a bandstand, if you put a brass band into a bandstand, there's not an awful lot of space left for the percussionist, so they certainly wouldn't be trundling around with timps and xylophones and all the rest of it. But obviously then as bands became more popular, if you like, and people were coming to see bands to give concerts, then actually you could go do an inside concert, and there's quite a lot more space if you're now in a concert hall for the percussionist to bring more instruments along with them and become more involved with the music and with the arrangements and the parts as it was going along.
We've kind of moved from like a level of interpretation, stylistic interpretation and musical interpretation from the percussionist to sort of more formalized parts, and then the pure logistics of getting onto a bandstand and moving into a concert hall where people are, paying for tickets instead of, just walking past on the pier or going to a bandstand. There's a level of sort of professionalism, and also you've got the space now to expand all these sort of things, which is fascinating.
And also then that would allow for another player to come in too. So it could be then you had a kit player and a timpani player, for example. It became more of a thing, more of a feature for the percussionists.
So on the flip side of the sort of entertainment, concerts and outdoor events, contesting is another layer of the brass band movement and world. Where does percussion feature at this sort of stage in terms of contesting?
Well, this was, when I was doing my research, this was the the biggest surprise. Although I have to say, when I joined Foden's, that was in 88, and some of the older members of the band were telling me when we were trundling around one day going to a contest, and I wasn't really sort of thinking that this was anything different than what had happened for the last 100 years, that percussion had only been allowed to be in contests for, at that point, less than just under 20 years. So this led me into another area of research as to, right, okay, why? What's going on? So I was kind of digging around and saw that up to 1873, 19 players in the band. After 1873, 24 players in the band, but no percussion allowed to be in the contest. And bearing in mind that, I mean, the Bellevue started in 1853. So, you know, it'd been going for a very, very long time. And okay, maybe at the very start, the pieces that were being written may not have included percussion in them, because obviously what was being adjudicated, if you like, was the brass band. But by the time you get into the 1910s, 1920s, the test pieces that were chosen, they did have percussion parts in them. They just weren't allowed to be played in the contest. And I was thinking to myself, okay, well, why is this? And I had it in my head at the time that it was a logistical thing, that it was to do with the instruments, it was to do with getting on and off the stage, it was to do with the players, it was that kind of element of it. And I kind of sort of thought, well, that must be it. It just must have been too complicated to be trundling things around for whatever reason. And then I dug around a bit more and I discovered that the reason was that percussion wasn't allowed to play with the bands in the contest was that it was felt that it was too much of almost like a decoy, that it would cover up what the band were doing. So if the band, for example, were playing something with the low brass were playing, and that would be a moment where the adjudicator was really listening for the tuning. If there was a big timpani roll or a bass drum roll at the same time, that would kind of make it more difficult perhaps for the adjudicator to be able to hear what was going on. If there was a big passage and it ended in a big flourish and the cornets ba-da, with a loud note at the end of it, there's a cymbal clash at the same time. Would the adjudicator be able to hear if the cornets had hit it clean, if there was another sound going on at the same time? And you can kind of see where they're coming from. I mean, at first I was like, what is this? And I was sort of outraged, and then I was sort of reading up a little bit more about it. And I have to say at this point that when I was looking into all this research, there's some fantastic material written by Jeffrey Brand, written by Elgar Howarth, and written by one of my very early mentors in my time in brass bands, which is Dr. Roy Newsom, who all three were also very interested in the development and how percussion has become developed within the bands. And I read various little bits and pieces that Dr. Roy had written, for example, about that, and the whole area of it being seen to have been a distraction. It was just too much of a distraction for what had been up for 100 years, a pure brass event. And I can kind of understand that. But the only exception, it is worth saying, is there's a competition in Edinburgh International Competition, I think it was called. It ran from the 1950s, and that did allow percussion to be in it. But the main contest, if you like, so the Bellevue, which became the Open, and then the national championships, didn't have percussion in them. I feel that sort of the aiming towards it area, I mean, obviously, as I said, there were percussion parts written for a lot of these contest pieces that were being used. And I think a very important person in all of this was Gilbert Vinter, who wrote lots of material, as we all know, but everything he wrote had percussion in it, and really good parts as well, kind of unusual instrumentation. Salute to Youth, variations on a ninth. His last piece, James Cook, Circumnavigator, has got a vibraphone part in it, so kind of very unusual. And for me, it kind of then fitted into the timeline, if you like, that 1969 was the first time that percussion was used in a contest. It was at the what was Bellevue. I can't remember if it was still called Bellevue at that point, or whether it was the Open at that point, but it was that contest. And it was one of his pieces that was chosen, which kind of is it's very a neat way of, if you like, of doing it, because the writing that he'd done up to that point for percussion, it's beautiful. It's fantastic writing for percussion. Every piece has got some really skillfully, beautifully written parts. And Spectrum, even, bearing in mind this is 1969 and the first time that percussion is being allowed in a brass band kind of situation, that percussion part, again, it's a fantastic part. It's got some unusual instruments in it. It's not just bass drum, snare drum, cymbals. So for the first time, and timpani, the first time that percussion is going in, it's not just kind of brooch at the end of a phrase or a big moment. We've got bongos, we've got claves, we've got all sorts of kind of intricate little parts going in. So it's not just a add-on, it is very much part of the piece and very much part of the blend and very much part of the overall performance, if you like, from the band. So that was a big surprise to me to find that out. And then, as I said, for me, joining Foden's in 88, my first contest, I think, was 88. That journey was less than 20 years. So I found that very interesting. Of course, it's sort of, it took a while to get going as all these new things, bearing in mind, as we said, this contest has been going for 100 years at this point. So the Nationals had percussion at first in 1973. I think that was Freedom by Hubert Bath. And then it kind of got phased in with the Nationals. So the youth bands then from 74, and then all sections from 75. So it was being kind of phased in. And it wasn't, from what I've seen in various publications, and again from the research done by Dr. Roy particularly, it wasn't a terribly popular thing to start off with. And again, I can understand that. We've got a tradition that has gone back a long, long way. We've also got some practicalities here as well. Percussion instruments are not cheap. They've never been cheap. They've always been quite, pricey. And at that point as well, sort of 60s, 70s, not readily available. There was only a few manufacturers, particularly in the UK, just a few manufacturers. So geographically, they were in a certain place. So, if you wanted to buy some timpani and you were in Cornwall, for example, you're talking a big job here to buy the instruments. Then obviously you're going to have to house all these instruments. You need the players to play all of these instruments, and even something as simple as going to the contest, what might have been a fairly straightforward affair to all get on a bus and off you go, now has turned into a rather more complicated affair with having to move your timpani around with you and all the instruments. So there was a cost and player implication, particularly as a lot of these pieces had parts for two players, and then obviously that grew and grew and grew over the years. But even having two players, if you're a band that's only ever had one player, suddenly you're having to find another player. So it got traction and it moved, and it kept moving, as we know. But I can definitely understand how difficult that could have been at the start for a whole host of reasons, not least, as I said, the financial implication of buying and sourcing all of those instruments, which really wasn't that easy at that time. I think another key piece of music in the sequence, if you like, was Elgar Howarth's piece Fireworks, written in 1975, if I remember rightly. And that piece is very much like it's kind of like the young person's guide to the orchestra, but young person's guide to the brass band. Every section is featured, and the percussion section part of it that's featured, again, it's fantastic writing. It's beautiful. It's really intricately written. It's got great direction in terms of, Elgar's quite specific about sticks to use, the sounds that you need to make, dampening instruments, all this kind of stuff. So you've got to be able to play your part very well. You've got to be able to blend with the rest of the section very well. You've got to be able to do some very quick changes, which is something as brass band percussionist, that's the absolute key. But it's a real test. It's not just, a couple of little notes here and there, and then let's go on to the euphoniums. It's a real test for the band, and actually the rest of the writing, if you like, for the rest of the piece, where it supports the other instruments when they're being featured. Again, it's fantastic writing, really beautifully crafted and integral to what the bands are doing. It becomes not just an add-on, it really is sort of absolutely part of it and part of the sound of the band and part of the blend of the band. So as I said, it sort of gets traction, it moves forward. By 1984, for example, Dances and Arias, Edward Gregson for the Nationals, I believe, and that's 3 parts, and that's 3 big parts. That's a big timp part and 2 big percussion parts that, lots of quick changes, multiple instruments. So there's a lot going on, and that's around the time then this is when I sort of came onto the area of brass bands, if you like. And as I said, just the parts that were coming in, the contests that were coming in, the contest music rather that was coming in, Philip Spark, Philip Wilby, Martin Ellaby, Edward Gregson, all of this beautiful writing that was coming in, and we would just, here's another amazing timpani part. Here's another Derek Bourgeois, another amazing percussion part. And like I said, I kind of didn't think, I sort of didn't realize what the background was and where we'd got to by that point. So that is a kind of an interesting area for me, and the time that I came in, if you like, as well.
It's almost unfathomable to think that we had contests without percussion, and we had, you were at the sort of the right place at the right time, like you said. Like, we had very pioneering composers in the brass band medium who were skilled percussionist writers, and that probably just surged everything forward in terms of instruments, numbers of players, the demands of the part. And I think these compositions can be very persuasive for those who think, oh, well, we don't need percussion at the contest. These parts are integral to the landscape of the piece, the overall effects that are being created. So bonkers and bizarre to think of a contest without percussion. It's really crazy to me, but so glad that we had so many fantastic composers and advocates for percussion in the brass band scene at that time.
Absolutely. And of course, the other area of contesting is the entertainment contest, and percussion obviously was always featured there. The 2 big entertainment contests, if you like, in the 70s, the Granada Band of the Year and what I always call Spennymoor, but which is now, was...
Me too!
Well, it was Rothman's, wasn't it? And Spennymoor and Brass in Concert, that contest. Obviously that always featured percussion. And again, we're into this area of some fantastic composers and arrangers. And for me, particularly, who I know, was my conductor at Phones at the time, which was Howard Snell, who just made the most fantastic arrangements for percussion features rather. I mean, percussion writing for the bands was great, was fantastic, but the features were really, really good. Solo features. He often wrote features for the section as well. So his Clock with the Dresden Figures, it's a lovely, lovely piece. Black and White Rag that he wrote for myself and Mark Oldham, who was my colleague at Foden's. And then sort of reworkings of very music hall type xylophone solos. There was one called Xylophonia, and he did an arrangement for me of that. But the band parts are beautiful. It's just it's a very fresh kind of arrangement. And it brings a lot of humour and character to it. So I think that's another area. And now, obviously, when we see the bands, there's often a percussion soloist. Gough Richards wrote some lovely solos for percussion features. So one called Rusky Perkusky, which is all instruments, and then his Zimba Zamba that he wrote for Evelyn Glennie with the National Youth, which became really very popular. Actually, it's a piece that I've played a lot as well. And composers now as well, obviously, who write so beautifully for percussion and arrange for percussion. So Sandy Smith and Paul Lovett Cooper, who of course is a percussionist, and Philip Harper and hundreds of other people, who write so beautifully for percussion and feature percussion as well. So it really does bring it right to the forefront, if you like.
It's just so fascinating that we've gone from maybe that one singular player on one singular instrument all the way through to percussion features, percussion soloists, a massive variety of instruments and skills on show. Everyone, please don't neglect your percussion section. There's some incredible parts and incredible players. And it just brings, I think, for me, the percussion and brass are such a good, it's a marriage made in heaven. And when you hear some of these incredible arrangements and test pieces, I couldn't think of a time when percussion wouldn't be an integral part of that, of a musical landscape like that. So thank you so much, Simone, for shedding light on when I was researching this, there was a serious lack of research in this area, I've got to say. So thank you so much for putting this together and taking us on a little journey here. Simone, where can people find out about you and the work that you do?
So I'm not playing quite as much as I was 20, 30 years ago because I have my job now at the Royal Northern, where I'm working with the percussion section, but I'm also working with wind and brass players at the college. And my involvement a lot with bands now tends to be as either guest soloist or a presenter or adjudicator, actually. So my website is really where it all happens. I'm a little bit old school. Everyone's always telling me off for not having a Facebook.
No, it's the original and best.
I'm very old school. So I guess my website is the place to see where things are happening. And I very much hope to continue writing articles for various magazines and journals. I'm very fortunate that I have worked alongside so many people that have helped me in my career. I've mentioned Howard Snell there. Rodney Newton is another one who's written a lot of music for percussion and arranged music for percussion as well. And I'm very grateful to everyone who's helped me on the way, particularly, of course, in Foden's, because Foden's gave me so many opportunities as both a player in the section, but also a soloist as well. And it really did set me up on my way. So I'm very much enjoy working with younger players at the moment, obviously at the Royal Northern, but also with the National Youth Brass Band, with the National Youth Children's Band, who I was thrilled to work with over the summer. It's very interesting for me to see those young percussion players coming through, and really embracing the whole range of percussion instruments and all of this music that we are required to play, and the skills and techniques that are involved, and how enthusiastic they are for that, I think is fantastic.
Well, thank you so much again. Hopefully we'll see you in some sort of sphere, hopefully in the brass banding sphere very soon. But thank you so much again, Simone.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thanks, Helen.
If you like the podcast, please help it to grow by liking, sharing, rating and reviewing. You can also support the podcast by leaving a tip or buying a perk, including asking my next guest a question or getting a shout out via Pod Inbox, link in the show notes. I'm happy to share that the podcast now has a Facebook page as well as Instagram, so please head on over and give it a like or review. Podcast music is Mephistopheles, performed by the Illinois Brass Band.